Hey, Warren, we're ready to get started, I think. Go ahead and
Okay.
get started. Yeah.
Okay. So I'd like to do a small prayer, a short prayer before we begin. I'm going to ask you to pray in your own way. I'm going to use a little bit of our language, and I hope you receive the sentiment if you do not understand. But when it comes to prayers, we all seem to ask for the same thing, regardless of what the language is. So with that, please join me in this small prayer. Ochacha shaksiyabad, ochacha shaksiyabad, chacha tzapa, chacha kaya, chacha t'is lachia, chacha t'is lachia, chacha t'is shayusiya. Asking you, Grandfather, to bless this day, to bless this work, asking you to give us the strength, the wisdom, the patience, and the understanding to move forward with what needs to be said, with what needs to be done. And I'm asking you to help us open our minds, open our hearts, and strengthen our bodies. Asking you for a blessing for our relatives, for the ones who are unable to attend with us this evening. Watch over our precious elders. Watch over our precious children. And with that, thank you.
Thank you once again, Warren. And thank you, everyone. Welcome, everyone. Again, we are even more delighted to have you here tonight for the second in a series of conversations among diverse communities impacted by the Puget Sound Treaty War and its aftermath. And we thank you all for joining us. In discussing this history, it is important to acknowledge the people and lands that were and continue to be impacted by these events. All of the tribal panelists are descendants of people who were in some way directly impacted by the Medicine Creek treaties and the wars that followed. We acknowledge the ongoing connection of tribal people to these lands and the continued effects of the Medicine Creek treaties today. We further acknowledge the ongoing stewardship of these lands by Native peoples and communities. Fort Nisqually was established as a Hudson's Bay Company trading post in 1833 and was reconstructed a century later on the traditional lands of the Coast Salish peoples. As Warren stated in our last panel, you are not going to separate the traditional people, the first people of this area, from the land. They're one and the same. We encourage each of you to consider the history of the lands you inhabit. And in the chat box, we will submit a link to an interactive map produced by Native Land Digital to learn more. And we hope this is a starting point for you to begin your own research. And again, tonight, it is my great pleasure to introduce our panelists and moderator. Brandon Raymond, Tribal Historic Preservation Officer and Assistant Director for the Puyallup Tribe. Brandon is an enrolled member of the Puyallup Tribe and the great-great-great-great-grandson of High Nuke, the treaty signer and Treaty Wars warrior for the Puyallup. He's been working for the Puyallup since 2008. Danny Marshall, Tribal Chairman, Steilacoom Tribe. Danny is an elder and the current elected chairperson for the Steilacoom Indian Tribe. He has been documenting the history and telling the story of his people since the 1970s. As part of the Steilacoom Tribal Council, he continues on a path and family legacy of leaders dating to the 19th century. Danny has provided guidance to the Steilacoom Tribal Cultural Center and Museum during its inception and since it opened in 1989. And we are pleased to welcome Danny as a first-time participant in this dialogue. Jerry Eckram, historian and author, Fort Nisqually Living History Museum. Jerry is a lifelong resident of Tacoma, has been involved with Fort Nisqually for 30 years. He's the author of Remembered Drums, A History of the Puget Sound Treaty War. And Netzie Bullchild, who is here in chat, and we will work to get her in on the panel as well. Netzie Bullchild is the director of the Nisqually Tribal Archives and Nisqually Tribal Historic Preservation Office. Netzie is an enrolled member and elder of the Nisqually Indian tribe. On her mother's side, Netzie is descended from Nisqually, Cowlitz, and Hawaiian ancestors. On her father's side, she is descended from Puyallup and Scottish ancestors, including John McLeod, a Hudson's Bay Company employee at Fort Nisqually. She has worked for the Nisqually Indian tribe for over 30 years. Warren King George, historian, Muckleshoot Indian tribe. Warren is an enrolled member of the Muckleshoot Indian tribe through his father's bloodline and a descendant of the Upper Skagit tribe through his late mother's bloodline. He has worked for the Muckleshoot Preservation Program since 2000. And our moderator tonight is Jennifer Ott, Assistant Director at historylink.org. Jennifer is an environmental historian and has been leading History Link's efforts to increase and improve tribal history on the site, primarily through telling the stories of Washington's watersheds. And thank you all for being here with us again. And I will submit the full bios of our panelists in the chat box, as well as some recommended resources for you to continue your research on Medicine Creek Treaty and the Puget Sound Treaty War. And we will leave time at the end of the program for your questions. If you would like to submit a question to the panel, please use the Q&A function located at the bottom of your screen. And if you'd like to interact with one another with tonight's program, you can do so using the chat. And we will be sending out a survey after tonight's program. We appreciate you taking a brief moment to fill that out. All of us here tonight on the panel have reviewed previous survey responses and other audience input in preparing for this discussion, so we greatly appreciate hearing from you. And again, thank you all for joining us tonight. We will work on getting Netzie in as well. And with that, we'll pass it along to Jennifer.
Thanks so much, Elizabeth. Thank you for having me. I would like to thank the Fort Nisqually Living History Museum for hosting this program. It's just an amazing opportunity to hear about this history and think further about it. And also, I have a prepared just short overview, and I'd like to thank all the panelists for their help in the things that they've taught me, and then the feedback that they have shared on this overview in particular, because it's made a tremendous difference in my learning process. So I'm going to give just this short overview to kind of set the stage for our conversation, and then we will jump into the panelists' thoughts. And so let me get my computer squared up here. Okay, it's not. There we go. Okay, so tonight is the second of a series of 4 panel discussions that we are having about the Puget Sound Treaty Wars. And we realized really quickly in the first one, there's a lot of story to tell. And so we want to be sure and kind of break it down. Tonight, we're going to focus on the treaty signing itself, the Treaty of Medicine Creek, which is in the Nisqually River Valley. And I'm going to give this very brief overview of the circumstances that led up to the signing of the treaty. And the next 2 panels will look at the war that followed the signing of the treaty and the effects of the treaties in the war, and the effects the war and the treaties had on the local tribal communities. So what led up to the Treaty of Medicine Creek? In very short terms, it was the Americans' desire for land and the meeting of 2 very different worldviews about what it means to live in a place. Indigenous people have lived here since time immemorial, building deep relationships to this place, the watersheds and the islands of the Holch, known today as Puget Sound. While many extended families and close relations lived in the same watersheds, there were also extensive networks of relationships throughout the region and over the Cascades. These connections were made and strengthened by intermarriage and spiritual and social gatherings, and also by trade. While they recognized families who managed the fishing, hunting, cultivating, and gathering in different areas, land ownership by individuals didn't play a role in the community, at least not in the same way that European settlers understood land ownership. The abundant resources were well used and managed, but an ethic of responsibility to the ancestors who came before and the generations who would follow guided people in the stewardship of the land and waterways. Stewardship of resources was and continues to be today deeply rooted in an ancient understanding of interconnectivity and interdependence. Shared creation stories lay out expectations for how one is to act in the world, which often involves the responsibility of reciprocal caretaking between all living things. While conflicts over land and resources, including some that resulted in bloodshed, did occur, vast family networks between tribal communities encouraged swift resolution. When the British established Fort Nisqually on Sequalachoo Creek in 1833, near today's DuPont, they brought a new worldview to this region, but it was somewhat compatible with the native community's existing trade practices. The HBC wanted a relatively small amount of land, and their primary purpose was trade. The HBC did do harm, particularly in terms of diseases they introduced into the region, the environmental impact of the fur trade, and the disruptions to existing social networks that they did have. But there was room in the Coast Salish world for new trading partners. And the HBC wove themselves into the existing network, albeit with some social and cultural clashes. That contrasts sharply with the arrival of the American settler colonists in the 1840s. They wanted to control the majority of the land in the region, and they wanted to introduce a new, much larger scale and more extensive market-based economy into the region, a realization of that manifest destiny we all heard about in grade school history class, embraced by Americans as they moved west across the continent. American law required that the federal government obtain title to the land from the local indigenous people through treaty making before individual Americans were supposed to be able to make any claims. The situation in the 1850s was made more urgent by the settlement of the international border in 1848 and the donation land law of 1850. That law allowed American citizens to claim land at no cost in Oregon Territory, which included the area north of the Columbia until 1853 when Washington Territory was established. They were supposed to wait until it was ceded by tribes and surveyed, but that's not what happened. People were establishing farms and towns around Puget Sound, squatting on the land in anticipation of being able to file claims once the land was ceded and surveyed. The federal government sent the first territorial governor, Isaac Stevens, to Washington Territory when it was established in 1853. Stevens was a military man, a graduate of West Point, and he surveyed a route for a transcontinental railroad on his way to the new territory. He can be seen as the human manifestation of American ambitions. Stevens could not have had less of a connection to this place. To him, it offered an opportunity to make a name for himself among people of influence in Washington, D.C., so he could return and continue his upward trajectory. With that mindset, in 1855, he set about meeting the letter of the law by making treaties with local tribes. The treaties were different from what we would normally think of as a treaty today. The first difference is that it was not the end of a war or a conflict. In fact, as we will learn next week, it was the start of a war. Second difference is that it's not between two parties with the same understanding of land and their relationships to it. And so it is not the same as having the Oregon Treaty of 1846, which established the international border between two Euro-American countries, and the tribal treaties of 1855 and 1856. They show how the American Convention of Treaty Making was being bent and twisted to fit a very different situation here in Washington Territory. And the third big difference is that it's not between two governments that had agreed to the same conventions of political relationships. The treaty process is embedded in a value system that assumes that land is something that can be owned by individuals, controlled or modified for gain, primarily economic gain, and its primary value is resources. But the indigenous people living in this region had a very different understanding of the land. First, land is specific. Family connections to particular places date back to time immemorial. And the second is that humans are part of the place and have reciprocal relationships with the land, plants, and animals. And this includes having that responsibility to the human and non-human inhabitants. Tribal leaders at the time could see that they needed to meet with Stevens, however, and so they agreed to the Treaty Council at Medicine Creek in December 1855. This was the first of the Stevens treaties signed in Washington Territory. And tonight we're going to discuss the purpose of the treaty, how Native people lived in this place, and how the Treaty Council was carried out. So thank you for wading through that overview. I hope it was helpful. And let's jump into the questions. And our first question tonight is, what was the purpose of the treaty? Let's start big. And there's multiple perspectives on this. And so let's take a look at who would like to start with what was the purpose of the treaty.
Sorry to interrupt beforehand. I was hoping that Netzi has joined us in audio. I wanted to confirm that she is here and she can address the questions. And she
There
is.
she is. Yay. Hi, Nancy.
Wonderful. Okay, Jennifer, if you don't mind repeating that question for our panelists, welcome, Netzi.
Sure. Nice to see you, Netzi. Our first question is, what was the purpose of the treaty? And we're looking at it from the different perspectives of what was the purpose it was serving. So who would like to go first tonight?
Well, I'll jump in with one purpose. There are a number and a lot of different perspectives. But if you had asked Governor Stevens the purpose, primarily it was determination of what land settlers can move on to, what land will be native land, and for the settlers, it was very much the desired purpose was that the land claims that they've taken out, that some of them had lived on now for several years, that those will be honored and that the land will remain in the possession of the settler. It's an entirely different perspective from someone whose family had lived there for thousands of years and knew full well that it was their land and not someone else's, regardless of a piece of paper. But the primary purpose, convening everyone, was to create reservations and open land for settlement and open land for the railroad to come, and all sorts of other developments that Governor Stevens envisioned in a growing, expanding territory under his control.
I think it's important to begin the concept of the purpose of the treaty as unneeded by the native people there. They didn't envision it as a necessary event to take place. Could the world continue to go on as it had and no treaty be written and signed? Probably. Nobody saw a need for it. Nobody really sat down and said, hey, things are going to get bad around here. More and more people are going to come and there's going to be crowding. There's going to be some difficulties that will occur as the new people continue to grow. And therefore we better put something in writing to guide that. The vision of the people was really that the world changes and it's good to build relationships and establish a new place in the world with the new people that come. Is it manageable? Yes. What was the purpose of the treaty? Maybe my ancestors said, I heard that there's going to be this thing happening, and if you show up, you get a free blanket. Maybe that was enough. For them, it was like, oh, it's some kind of event. It's going to take place, and if we go, we're going to get a blanket. Maybe that's worth checking out. Let's get the family together and take the journey, because it was a journey to get there.
Yeah, we might have to listen to a sales pitch, but at least there's that blanket.
So I'd like to start, Nancy Child. My thought is, if you go back to pre-treaty, tribes lived off the land provided all their needs. Tribal relations, if there were conflict, they were resolved quickly, such as mistreatment or stealing. There was intertribal marriages, arranged marriages. Explorers named areas after people. Tribal people used descriptive names, language, so other tribes knew what was being talked about with the language differences. Explorers would eat with tribal people they encountered if they were not run off by tribal people. And even in the Lewis and Clark expedition, they were saved by tribal people in order to make it to the Pacific Northwest. Traders were also treated well, respected by tribal people of the land, animals, place, and sacred sites. To this day, we have ceremonies and stories such as the first salmon ceremony. So pre-treaty, you know, it was all good, you know, and there was survival by tribal people plus people that entered our territory. You know, we were literally saving some of these explorers and settlers that came in. So from there on, you know, the treaty, the purpose of it was just to own that land, you know, by whatever means and by whoever came. So Stevens was the one that was, you know, sent to do this. But like I said, there was issues there, but you know, when he called the council to negotiate, you know, the treaty was already written, you know, it was explained in Chinook jargon, which was a big language barrier. Others, you know, advised Stevens, tribal people would sign, you know, tribal leaders believed the promises made. Tribal leaders for the treaty were selected by Stevens and his agents or officials. Tribal leaders appointed by tribes were for specific reasons or issues. Each tribe chose their tribal leaders and protocol was different in each tribe. And families came out for the ceremony. What they thought was, you know, they were told there was going to be gifts. Tribal ceremonies such as potlatches, all personal property was given away. So there was a difference of interpretation of why they were coming to this council. Tribal gatherings were for trading, socialized marriage arrangements, not to sign away land, you know? So there's this big issue on what was the purpose. There's two different interpretations, two different viewpoints.
So just to paraphrase that, there would have been other times when tribal communities would have gotten together like this, but it wouldn't have ended or had the same purpose because it would have been more for distributing personal goods or resolving a conflict that was already in process. Was that a good kind of distinction between what Stevens was expecting to see happen as people gathered and what the tribal folks expected to see happen?
It was just a complete different viewpoint. You know, tribal people were going because they were used to, like I said, potlatches where, you know, that was a ceremony or another ceremony. They went and socialized with other tribes. This was a whole different, you know, just different arena. You know, you're like I have said, who in their right mind would give away all this land? You know, so there was just no way they, you know, would have signed a treaty knowing what was going to happen. And, you know, the truth wasn't told and there was promises made, you know, that just didn't happen.
And there's some significance to the location as well. So when you think about where the treaty council took place, it was in an area that was traditionally used between the Steilacoom and the Nisqually tribe to come and have intertribal communication take place. So it was right on what would have been considered the border between Steilacoom and Nisqually, and they would have come there for holding events that involved both of the tribes. So to call something there that was like, let's invite all the tribes. In fact, Stevens, you know, pretended that he was inviting all the tribes from the Puget Sound, and that was his intent. But the tribes that ended up there, really, there was some significance to that, to go there, like what Netzi was talking about for a tribal gathering. That was important. And guess what? There's some traditional things like blankets, and nobody really cared about flour at the time, but flour was given to them as well.
Calico.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think a lot of it too is, you know, you think about both Chairman Marshall and Netzi both kind of hit on both sides of and so did Jerry, but, you know, Governor Stevens came with the full purpose of getting Indians off the land. I mean, he wasn't trying to negotiate anything. He wasn't negotiating. He wasn't coming to negotiate. He was coming to tell us what was going to happen, and it was up to us to accept it or you know, be killed. Really, that's kind of what he was so frustrated by day 3. That's really what it boiled down to. But I think when you think about what we were coming for, we, like Nancy was pointing, we were coming for a potlatch. And so we were completely blindsided by what one, we couldn't understand what the heck they were saying. You know, we're trying to interpret from this new language that we were being told to understand through the trading process. And so, you know, most of the people that were in attendance had no idea what was being said. And so there was absolutely no understanding. You know, here we are coming for a party, and you're here to do a business negotiation where you're going to steal from us, you know. And so just imagine, you know, imagine that mentality, that mentally you're not prepared. You know, you don't go to a business meeting the same way you go to a party, right? Your guard is down. And so what the purpose of the treaty was, we didn't know. We didn't know what the treaty was, so we didn't have a purpose of a treaty. What is a treaty? We didn't really settle things this way, as Nancy pointed out. And so, you know, there was just no way to really gather what the heck we were there for.
Warren, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, just a few comments, Jennifer. Thank you. And wonderful words and great comments, everybody, to all the previous speakers. The intent of a treaty was basically to prepare the area, prepare the territory for this donation land claim opportunity. And so 1850 donation land claim.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the governor was handed the task from the president, Pierce, to get these treaties in place, because there are current residents there, because there are people living there, and those people are in the way of this expansion opportunity, of this land claim opportunity. And so, you know, which in a sense admits that there is an existing residence, you know, throughout these watersheds, throughout these water lines, throughout the Puget Sound and the tributaries, and throughout these lake areas. There are existing residents there, and you need to do something with them. And so, which basically admits that we were here, is what the treaty does, announces, and that we have to go through this formal process in order to get us out of the way for this 320 or 640 acre opportunity for the non-natives to come in here and claim some acreage. And then I think one of the other tasks was to map the area, get it ready for the railroads, right? Get ready for that flood of these non-natives to come in here and stake their claim on what is essentially native Indian land, First Peoples land.
So this is interesting. Each of you have mentioned this, and I had never thought about this before, is that you have one expectation among the Native people that this is a social gathering, and all of the things that they do around this, the place where they meet, the people who are there, because women were there also, right? And I assume children and elders. So it wasn't just the men. There were no, as far as I know, no white women coming to this. So on the one side, you have much more of a community gathering with a community expectation and a meeting of people. And on the other side, on the settler side, you have a business transaction going on that does recognize that there are prior owners, but does not really intend to deal with them as they would perhaps a white property owner. Like, it's not the same discussion as it was with the Canadians over at Oregon Territory and the international border. So it's really interesting how just in this one place you have two very different, almost like they're coming to two different things, but Stevens is intending to leave with something that is very much a business deal when he leaves. And I had never thought about that. So it's really interesting. Jerry, I'm wondering if you know, were there any sort of, in the newspapers or in letters, any sort of rhetoric or public conversation going on about what the white settlers were expecting Stevens to do once he arrived or once the Treaty Council was called?
Well, it was said quite often as the settlers came in and they picked out this piece of land that they wanted. If there were native objections, they would say, no, don't worry about it. The government's going to take care of it. They're going to pay you for the land. You just wait and you'll be rewarded and everything will come out right. I don't think the natives realized until very close to the time of Medicine Creek just how many of settlers were coming in. It's hard to get your head around the kind of numbers that were back east by the millions, and that they would be arriving here by the thousands fairly soon. And that, I think, put some extra, or lit an extra fire under Governor Stevens, because he knew full well he was the tip of the spear, that he was not only representing who's here now, he's also clearing the way for thousands of people who are going to be coming in very soon. And that's another place where I think the natives were kind of blindsided. They had seen a few whites. I don't think would have any way of knowing just how many there were back east and how many of them may be traveling this way.
But also, Jennifer, it's the point that the tribal people that came were from different tribes. You weren't talking about one group that all spoke English or all spoke French or all spoke, you were talking multiple tribes, like that with their families. So there was that whole different interpretation. And this treaty was already written. There was no, okay, you guys tell me what you want. You guys, it was just promises made. And, that is, tribal leaders were looking out for their people. So what were they to do? They had to protect them. And instead of, like you see down, and I don't know if it's going to come down the line, their intent also was to move all of these tribal people, different tribes, into one reservation or one place. So that's just like me saying, oh, Brandon, I'm going to move all my family into your house. You're going to like it. So there's a lot of things that were on the tribal side that they had to think about, and those leaders were appointed. They weren't there because, they're like, oh yeah, we agree with this treaty. We're coming to sign, like Warren pointed out before, they put that X on the paper, whether that person signed or not. But I don't know how you could think that when they didn't even understand the language. What does this X mean? So that's the whole thing of this, is there was all different tribes that came. It wasn't just one tribe that they were dealing with at that time.
And Stevens and his party had not taken the time, nor would they have really, were they concerned that they weren't dealing with a monolith, right? That wasn't part of their strategizing or anything. They just took the people as a group and expected them to respond as a group. Was that accurate?
Yeah, we didn't have any record of them coming and meeting individually with the tribes. So they didn't come out ahead of time. I'm wondering what Netzi has led me to think, though, was maybe they're a threat as well. So it's possible that one of the ways they got people to show up there was to say, hey, if you don't show up, something bad's going to happen. So you better show up for this event. Because the other thing is, I don't know, but how usual would it be for us to have one of these kind of intertribal celebrations in the middle of winter down there in the Nisqually flatlands? That's not common. People are in their longhouses kicking back with their families, and they're not traveling out in the middle of December to go stay outside.
Yeah, the darkest days of the year. Yeah. So let me ask, before we move on to the next topic, just ask one last question. I talked about how the HBC was a party that could be interacted with, that there was a commonality of the trade networks. And I don't want to give the impression that the tribal folks did not make any attempts to interact with the white settlers. And so are there any examples that you can share of how there were some relationships, there were some attempts to coexist, even though people were claiming land that was not up for claiming and that sort of thing? There was tension, I know, but were there any, there were efforts, I know. Do you guys have any examples that maybe you could share?
Well, there was a very telling moment, I think, when the first wagon train made its way up to southern Puget Sound from the Oregon country. It was called the Simmons Party. It was led by Michael T. Simmons. And the story that I've heard is that when they arrived, they received an invitation from some say Leshai, some say another individual, perhaps Lachalet. I may be mispronouncing his name, and I do apologize. But they received an invitation to join the tribe. And basically what they were being offered was immigration and naturalization. Mm-hmm. You're welcome here, honor our customs, obey our laws, and you'll be treated as a brother. And basically the reaction was, no, we're not joining your tribe. You don't understand, you're going to be under our laws. You're part of the United States now, and our government's coming, and eventually there's going to be treaties and there's going to be documents, but no, we don't join your tribe. We're here to bring American democracy and American civilization to Puget Sound, and eventually you'll have to accept that. And I think that was a very telling moment when, perhaps for the first time, some of the natives began to realize there's some huge changes here that we may not welcome at all.
Much different than the relationship with Hudson's Bay Company, right? Because their sole purpose was not to come and take the land, but to take resources or trade for the resources, but they were there for another whole purpose. And so building a relationship with the tribal people that was like, hey, we want to interact with you on whatever your customs and rules are, so we can benefit by trade, and we'll give you some stuff and you can give us some stuff, and everybody's going to be happy. So that was different than hey, let's come and empower ourselves to take over responsibility for the land. That was a new thing.
Yeah, I love that point. It's probably one of the earliest examples of export. There was a business relationship, clearly, and it certainly reflects the HBCs. They're not being familiar with the land and the territory and the resources, so why not establish a relationship with the locals, and the locals will be able to get the best furs and the best meat, the best deer and elk and fish, and the best beaver, etc. So yeah, that makes, there was something there before Stevens came in and fouled things up.
So thank you. And let's go ahead and move on to the next topic. Just looking at the time. So I wanted to talk about how how are relationships in tribal communities related to resource use? How did that affect how people connected with each other, and how sort of the hierarchy or governance, however you would describe it, of the tribal communities related to resources?
Well, one thing I think you'll find is that different areas provided different resources. The Snoqualmies, one of their major trading items seemed to be mountain goat fur or hair, which was used in making blankets before wool was available. That and a native dog that was sheared something like a sheep. Other resources. Puget Sound, you had access to clams, you had access to salmon runs. Eastern Washington, you would have access to the products of that environment. So different tribal groups had different resources, and in order to obtain some of those resources, there was a lot of trading, visiting back and forth between tribes. Trade was not a new concept. The fur traders didn't invent trade here. Trade had been going on for thousands of years.
Does anyone want to try it? And I know it's a big story to encapsulate in a short answer, but how are salmon, who could fish where, and what were those relationships that managed that relationship to the salmon and their resources?
I
Randy,
guess I'll take a stab at it first, but please warn Anetzi, they're my elders. They can tell me to shut up anytime. Don't worry about it. I think the relationship between the land and the family, so like different family groups had connection with their different areas that they would specialize. Like families had areas that they fished, had areas that they hunted, family had areas that they gathered, and so I mean there was that sense of this is our relationship. We have a special relationship in this area with the land. Something where everyone has in our family has always gathered, and so there was that connection. But there's always the trade between tribes existed for thousands of years. Like it was Jerry was alluding to was the certain resources like Puyallup had lots of shellfish, had lots of salmon access, had lots of cedar access. I guess we all had cedar access, but I mean the abundance of just shellfish and salmon from Commencement Bay, allowed us to be a center point, where we could do a lot of negotiating with the surrounding tribes and become that focal point. And so, we were always able to gather and always have that relationship with the resources, but there was always a sense that, the resources were not limitless. We had to care for it. We had to make sure that we used things respectfully. These are gifts from the Creator, and if we didn't want to do anything to upset the Creator, the ancestors, everything was done in a manner that was managing the resources responsibly. And and the trade network was also that. We didn't trade more than what we could, and I think a lot when you start seeing HPC come into the picture, where they're wanting to have us trade, and gather more for a little in return. We were given resources in return, but it wasn't in the same capacity where we're gathering lots of salmon, lots of shellfish, lots of furs for them, and then trading them for calico. While we did have a desire for these new resources coming in, I think we quickly realized that, hey, wait a minute, they're upsetting this balance that we've had for thousands of years on our resources. And so I think that's where we start seeing our ancestors like, well, wait a minute, let's start paying attention to what's going on here. And then in come the influx of all the non-natives too. So I think we're all being blasted with something brand new, all so quick, where we just didn't quite have a chance to fully react before everything started happening to us, the pandemics, our homes being destroyed, all that sort of thing. And so it just came in such a big flash.
There were individuals that really guided the protection of the resources within each of the areas, and it was mostly a family thing, like has been talked about. It really was something that families were together in villages, and those villages then were the ones that oversaw what happened there and made sure that not too much was taken, but the balance that was talked about, that's something that you have to think about, because only the most well-to-do Indian person would have a wool blanket. That was rare. I mean, it took a lot of either dog wool or mountain goat wool to put together a wool blanket. That was a resource that was very valuable. And obviously today there aren't as many beaver around, and that probably was the impact of that tremendous, number of beaver skins that were being taken out of here. But we've got this blanket at the Tribal Cultural Center in Steilacoom that has 3 stripes on the side of it, and it's a Hudson's Bay blanket. That meant it was worth 3 beaver pelts. And I'm just thinking how easy it was for somebody comparatively to making a wool blanket to go out and gather 3 beaver skins and trade it for that blanket. Now it's like, I've got a wool blanket. That's significant. That's big. Like we talked about, that was one of the things that was offered at the Medicine Creek Treaty negotiations, the council that took place. And then the other thing I'm just thinking about as I'm hearing everybody talk is that all these things that we're talking about are personal promises. It's the thing that we make agreements between each other. None of that's on paper. That was new. Medicine Creek Treaty on a piece of paper, it's like, what is that? What difference does it make if I put an X on there? You're pushing me and making me do that. I know that's a part of the process, but that's new. It's like promises weren't made that way. And we know that there were people that said, we're not seeing this as something genuine when they were there for that. Said, this doesn't seem right to me. Some things aren't sounding right. That's not how we make promises. And I'm not sure you're on board with this. So I'm not going to agree. That happened.
Yeah, that's true. That interpersonal relationships piece of all of this.
So my comment is, the land was really life, for us. We used all the resources, but we never wiped them out. A lot of these practices are coming back, burning the fields for, to help other plants grow, they're even talking about to do away with wildfires, because they're finding, the native habitat that was there worked. And tribes knew this, they shared it with other tribes. And like I said, if they were lacking something, that's where the trade came in, for say Yakimas that didn't have the shellfish and wanted it, they came and traded. So there was always that network, but we never ever wiped out the resources, and everything we did was by season. There was a time, so the tribes knew by the stars, the sky, when it was time to gather things, when it was time for certain ceremonies. And that was just natural. The stories were told by our elders so that you knew when you were supposed to do things and at what time and why you did it, and you preserve. So now, when people preserve, tribes were doing that way back then. So I know in one of Cecilia's books, she talked about that. She says, a lot of these explorers, and they just thought tribes were lazy. And it was like, no, they had already done their work, preserved their food. They were ready for winter, so they didn't have to do anything else because now they've all provided for their families, they were taken care of. But they didn't understand that. They just thought, like Brandon said, they should keep getting more and more and more. And it was like, no, we only take what we need. And we wait for the next season when we go gather more.
So this is so interesting. Warren, I don't want to put you on the spot, but this is kind of what we talked about yesterday when we were chatting, that idea that you don't take more is not just not being voracious. It's also based in the knowledge that people had that like now I would need a fisheries degree to know how to manage salmon, but there was not a fisheries degree, but the knowledge was there. And so can you talk maybe, Warren, a little bit about what is that relationship with the non-human parts of the world and that knowledge and how that connects to place? Like all of those things kind of come together in this, and how resources were used in a sustainable sort of way.
Sure, I'd be happy to, Jennifer. Thank you for the question. And I enjoyed those comments, everybody. Excellent response. So these, what we're calling traditional places or place names, in using some terminology from ethnographers today, these places were unique, and they were identified by their natural resource. They were identified by how generous they were with these natural resources. Mother Nature, she works in her own way, and interpreting her sometimes takes a very long time. And once that relationship has been established, you heard Danny reference it, it goes from generation to generation. Now you pass that information on, and they become specialized in that, dealing with fish, dealing with elk and deer and maybe mountain beaver or huckleberries or camas or wild lily, etc. And these families become the caretakers of this resource, unofficially, right? But they're masters at it. They become masters at it without going to the 4-year college, without going to the 2-year college, without going to these technical colleges. This is information and this is training that they've inherited through their elders, through their teachers, their traditional teachers, through their aunties and uncles, their mothers and fathers, their grandparents. And this is what creates this and continues this relationship that we have with the land. And this will help people understand that, because we've been eating this food for so long, because we've been harvesting and been tending this wild resource for so long, this relationship goes far beyond any, I guess, what any treaty paper will say. So your original question was about how the tribal communities and tribal relations are connected via natural resources. Well, you heard Brandon say that there's these villages on the saltwater that have a specialty, a special knowledge about the saltwater foods. And then there's the upriver people who have a very deep rooted relationship with the ungulates, with the four-legged animals. And so, obviously, we can't make time to be in both places at the same time when the tides are out during the springtime, when the dog flowers are in bloom. We don't have time to be out at the beach at all times for several weeks at a time. While at this elevation today, right now, the dogwoods are just ending, but the blackberries and the wild strawberries are starting to turn. Well, who's going where and when? So, in these family dynamics, we need to figure out, who carries that gift, who has that interest, who has that special knowledge. Well, all that is figured out, and then we take these material things, we take these gifts from Mother Nature, and we'll trade them, and we'll work out a deal with our in-law that we married in Nisqually, or our in-law that we married up north to Steilacoom. So we create that network, and we take that bond and we build on it with these trade networks, with our specialty knowledge, and then we bring them all together, and then we strengthen them by continuing this information sharing, and with opportunities just like this is a good example, reminding everybody of who you are and where you come from and how we're related.
Yeah, Brandon.
And so I think, as far as the treaty goes, now you see from the tribal perspective why this was such a crazy thing to think. We have all these independent and individual family groups that have all these connections with these natural resources on these particular pieces of land. And now this guy is telling us that we got to get off, that we got to go and live on areas and we're not used to living on, that we're familiar with because it's part of the lands that we use. But I'm a fisherman, and then at Puyallup, they wanted to go put them up on the hill, with no access to water, no access to the river, no access to the sound. And then, so you're asking me to leave that you know, and then what? And then not, oh, but now I'm supposed to farm, you know? And so I think, what is farming, you know? And so I think, you know, you hear in all of these testimonies tonight of our connection with the land, and then all of a sudden being ripped from that, you start understanding why the treaty was so resisted.
And that didn't happen on December 24th,
Right.
1854. They didn't say, hey, this is your destiny. They just said, hey, you get to stay where you're at. In fact, that was the big promise. Everybody gets land in their own area. That didn't become reality, especially for the Steilacoom people. But that was the promise. You get to stay in your village. You get to continue gathering all the resources you always have. You get to take care of the land just like always. We promise. Just put your X on here. Pick up your blanket and go home.
That is the perfect segue. Thank you. To the last question, and I'll actually, Jerry, if maybe I could put you on the spot to start this one, is if you could. We've talked already, and we've alluded to the fact that it was not a negotiation, that Stevens brought pre-written treaties. And so it was more of a negotiation over trying to get people to agree to sign it. And so can you, Jerry, talk about what was in that document and where did it come from? I already saw a question go by of what precedence was being drawn upon and that sort of thing. So maybe set the stage for the actual document, and we'll talk about what was discussed at that treaty council.
The whole process of treaty making was in a state of flux by this time. The United States government worked out somewhere around 368 or so treaties with the natives. And the pattern in the past had been basically to move the Indians from the East Coast further west. In 1846, the year that we had a treaty between the United States and Great Britain that said the Northwest, now Oregon, Washington, etc., was American land. There was a map published that same year that showed what was called the Indian Territory, basically in the middle of what's now the United States, that included Kansas, Nebraska, Oklahoma, part of Iowa. At that point, they were moving Cherokee, Choctaw, Seminole Indians from the East Coast out here to the Midwest. In 1851, the government started something rather new. They created then what I guess we might now call a policy of assimilation. Because basically by the time Medicine Creek rolled around, they had run out of west to send tribes off to. So the decision was, we'll create a homeland in or near where they live now. And part of what was offered was there was a cash payment, a small one, but if you have no previous experience with money, if somebody says $30,000, it might sound like a lot. You might wonder, okay, how many cooking pots does that buy? Things like that. Also, then the treaty offered it was going to set up schools. A doctor would be provided on the reservation, and a lot of other things. Some rather noble aspirations that turned into some pretty nightmarish things like boarding schools, and we'll probably talk about in the last of our discussions. But the treaty offered basically saying, okay, we'll set it's not we're going to give you this land. This is the fragment of your 2.5 million acres of land that we're not going to take away. So you get to live on this part that we don't take away. But there were a lot of promises, and there was never a guarantee. Stephen started this, that the treaty would be ratified by the government back east. One of the treaties that the governor of Oregon had worked out was not ratified, and basically put him back in square one. And it was very embarrassing, because if you tell people that things are going to be a certain way and then they're not, well, it's going to look like you lied to them. And Stevens was well aware of that going to Medicine Creek. He needed to come back with something that would be palatable to the government or the Great White Father back in Washington, D.C. What's palatable in Washington, D.C. may not always be what's palatable in a village on Sequoia Creek.
Was there precedent for having the reservation of hunting, fishing, and gathering rights?
That was something that was fairly new, as far as I know. Basically, when they were moving the tribes from the east and creating Indian Territory in the Midwest, basically they were on their own. They were going to hunt, fish in a vast area. You could hunt and fish across Kansas and Nebraska and Oklahoma to your heart's content. But it was a fairly new thing to say that you're going to have hunting and fishing rights in common with all citizens of the territory. That basically the treaty said, yeah, you'll be able to go back and gather salmon where you always gathered them. At least that was the wording of the treaty, and probably the way it was expected. Well, it took an awful lot of court battles and some pretty tough times in the 20th century to try to regain some of those promises that had been made.
Jennifer?
Mm-hmm.
So in my mind, the treaty, the only thing that I can see that, and it wasn't really a benefit, but that the tribes got out of it, was the fishing, hunting, and gathering. The rest was all created to supposedly civilize tribal people. You know, if you look through all the articles, there's nothing there that benefits the tribe. Even with the schools, the medical, I mean, in there it says to give them vaccines. Of what? You know, when you put a vaccine like the flu in somebody, you're giving them that, you know, virus. That was their goal. So everything that you look in all of these articles, you know, there wasn't enough money. There wasn't enough land. You know, when you're talking, you're trading 2.5 million for 1,280, which is, you know, what they were supposedly getting. But if you go article by article, you know, there was only those little benefits. I mean, they were supposed to, you know, give up their horses, you know, do a lot of things that they had. And it was all to be gone just for this little piece of reservation that they didn't even keep that promise, you know, to move them on that. But same thing, it depended on the tribe. So you had all these tribes that don't even exist anymore, which I feel very bad about because they were absorbed into other tribes because of the 3 reservations. So you probably have descendants of them, but, you know, they just don't exist. So there's just a lot of things with the treaty, if you go article by article, that's just really devastated all tribes.
That's a really interesting point that while there were the reserved rights and the reserved land, that the bulk of the document is intended for changing the way of life and changing the structures of communities. And I hadn't ever thought of it that way before. That's really important, I think, to understand about it. Yeah.
We really don't have a good record of the conversations that took place. It would, and they wouldn't want to say that anyway. So Stevens wasn't going to make notes about, here's what I really said. I mean, here's what's on the document. We've got that written document now, but there's no way people were going to sign off or agree to that unless they were getting promises to be able to continue their lifestyle. And that was the big thing that people were accepting, is that, our way of life is not going to change. You're going to be allowed to continue to hunt and gather and live in your villages. And not only that, we're gonna set aside a chunk of land that nobody else is going to be able to mess with. And that's where we'll go. And it's like, okay, this sounds good. I mean, doesn't that almost sound like, you know, what we were already doing with the Hudson's Bay Company people when they were here, living in our villages, hunting and gathering as usual, and sounds like maybe everything's going to be the same, hopefully.
But the chunk of land was worthless.
Right.
Tribes.
And people got that later, right after the treaty was signed. Then, yeah, that's the next chapter of the story.
Well, I think that's why you have a lot of people that didn't sign. I mean, that's why I think you have a lot of leaders that said, yeah, no, I ain't doing this, you know, and that's where I think Leshai, you know, really recognized that right away, what was going to happen. And that's why I think he started that, hey guys, listen, this is what they're saying. This is, you know, I'll put it in what I understand. Here's what's going to happen. And that's why I think him and a large cohort of leaders said, you know what, we ain't doing this. And that's why I think, you know, only a small portion of the attendees actually did sign it. And even then, it's my opinion too, that they didn't really understand. They were just trying to survive with what they had. You know, you think about the tribes like the Squabops who were from the Vashon and Gig Harbor area had been wiped out. Here they are, they're coming to this, they're showing up to this meeting and this potlatch, and you know, listen, we got nothing left. We're just going to try to survive. Sure, if you're like what you're referring to, Chairman, you know, is, hey, let's just, yeah, it's kind of what we've been doing. It's at least something we have from our way of life. You know, let's go with it. And even I think our own Puyallup leader at the time, the Squattahan, he was there, and that was kind of his sentiment. Like, listen, let's just try to hang on to the way of life that we have. So there was definitely that group of people who had that sentiment. But I think a large number of people were like, no, we ain't agreeing to this.
Mm.
That's a really important point, that we're already at this point, people have suffered from disease and displacement. It's not as if everything was perfect coming up to this point, and then they had, you know, as many choices as they wanted. There was already a lot of impact of non-native people being here. So that's something that, you know, we didn't really get to dig into, but that people were already struggling, particularly those smaller groups, I think, like that. Yeah, I know in Seattle that one village, the one that was located where Pioneer Square is, that they think that it had been abandoned because of disease. And so there had been a bit of a consolidation of family groups. So
Seeds of knowledge.
I wasn't going to be brave enough to try. One Lucy word a night.
No, baby steps, Jennifer.
Yes. So we're actually right at the time for questions, but I want to make sure that there's nothing that anyone else would like to add. Warren, you didn't get to add anything to that last question, so if you'd like to, we can make time. That's just fine.
Yeah, just a brief comment, Jennifer. Thank you. So the intent, you know, where did it come from? The treaty business. You know, I think we've answered that before, and we addressed that partly in the beginning of our conversation of its purpose, and the intent was to remove the existing residents and push them aside and get them out of the way, so that these non-natives can come in and stake their claim. But there was some, I think it's pretty, on my end anyway, I don't recall the original draft or the draft treaty having including usual and accustomed hunting, addressing hunting and fishing areas. That was one of the big concerns about the treaty, if I recall. Danny, you touched on it, that, you know, if there's the access and the continuity, the opportunity to continue to be Indian, the opportunity to live a lifestyle that has been established for thousands of years. 14,000 years is a number I recall from. That's how long our ancestors have been in this area. what we call Washington Territory or Washington State. You know, we've always been here since the glaciers receded. So, and if I recall, that was one of the things that, you know, that didn't fare very well, was that not only do we want you to uproot yourself from your traditional place, but go to this watershed and go live with these people, you know, and not that it's go live with your neighbors. That's not how it's going to work. I mean, that's not going to go very well. It wouldn't work today. You know, certainly wouldn't work, you know, 160 years ago. And I think that there's also another fact that the ones that didn't sign or refused to sign, you know, that created huge problems. You know, if they walked away from that meeting, if they walked away from that opportunity, you know, then they were going to be homeless. And we all know where that goes. Even in today's pandemic, we know what that means and what happens to the homeless. That's what basically would have happened if there was no treaty war, which I think we'll discuss more in our next panel.
Thank you.
Well, and you know, here on Article 2, and it says that, you know, that, you know, so far as survey, you know, they were supposed to survey, and non-tribal people were not supposed to be we were not supposed to be residing on that land until all of that happened, you know. But like you said, they were already living on tribal land, you know, so what were the tribes supposed to do when they were trying to gather fish, whatever, and they're not even supposed to be there, you know, and they gave the tribal people like a year to move off of your land that you were used to, but yet these other people could move right back on, you know. So like I said, in every article, they covered everything that was really, they tried to act like it was doing us a favor. But, you know, it was very devastating to have to do that. And then it was just always this, you know, you say one thing, but then you let them do the other thing. And so they could live on it without it being surveyed, but you had to move off within 1 year, you know, this place that you were used to living on. So like I said, when you go through these article by article, there was nothing good that came out of it.
And I'm not sure that anybody really understood that there was any negative potential for not signing the treaty. So even though potentially they end up homeless, I'm not entirely sure that people understood that, hey, is this really a negotiations, or what happens if I decide this doesn't sound right to me? I don't think this is genuine. What if I walk away and we come back and talk about this later? Or if we have to, we'll come back and fight about this later. But what happens? Do I get to go back to my village? Are you coming after me at my village? I'm not sure anybody really made it very clear what was going to happen there.
It's interesting though, one of the things that I've noticed in just studying the history of the region is that it's frustrating how, frustrating is not the right word, but it's not as if, even though this is an enormous space that we're talking about, the places that were valuable to tribal members were also valuable to non-native people. And so you have some conflict already happening at really significant resource places or town site places. And so I think that even though it seems like there should have been lots of elbow room at the time, I don't think there really was. I think there was already that feeling of people jostling against each other, which seems hard to imagine, but I think that does tell us that people need certain things to live, and those are aggregated in certain places. And so it seems like you should be able to pick your 320 acres, but that isn't what was happening. So thank you, everyone. Let's switch over to the questions. There's some really great ones. And I'm just gonna start with the first one. Rob Smith is wondering, are the treaties in Washington significant beyond the immediate region? And does this experience tell a larger American story which more people should know about? Yes. Was there anything unique about these treaties compared to others in the country? That's a big question, which I'm sure Rob is aware of, but would anybody like to answer that beyond the, yes, everyone should know more about these treaties and understand the significance of them, but what else would you like to say to that?
Well, one thing that may have been unique about these was for Governor Stevens, it was the beginning of a marathon. He worked out, I believe it was 10 treaties across the rest of Washington and into Idaho and Montana, which were all part of Washington Territory at the time. I don't know of another instance where one person worked out that many treaties with that many different peoples in such a short time.
Did they all lead to wars?
A good many of them. With the Yakimas, the Palouse, the Spokane. Later on, there were some huge wars in Idaho and Montana. But yeah, in the 1850s, there were wars across a good part of eastern and western Washington.
We didn't get a chance to reflect much on the impact on the British people that were here with Hudson's Bay Company either, but they felt the impact of this as well by the Americans coming in and the border being set and them being told that, hey, look, you don't really have a place here any longer. They were they were instigators to try and bring some conflict between the Americans and the Indian people as well.
Well, yeah, I think in that instance, the HBC and the native populations, they did have basically a common, maybe enemy is too strong a word, but a common threat and menace. The American settlers were a major thorn in the side of the Hudson's Bay Company, as it created the Puget Sound Agricultural Company and a farming enterprise that claimed thousands of acres across a large part of southern Puget Sound. And we had the same difficulties with American settlers coming onto HBC land as the natives had with the settlers coming onto what they regarded as their land. The doctor told me, who ran Fort Nisqually, spent a lot of time in court trying to deal with what he considered American squatters on his company's land. And since it was an American court, he just about always lost. So in that respect, yeah, I think probably, the Hudson's Bay Company had a sales shop and a trade store, and they regarded the Americans as potential customers as well, but they weren't happy that they were moving onto their land, killing their cattle and a lot of their sheep, and just basically mucking around with their resources.
Did anyone else want to speak to that one?
Well, for tribes, we're talking territory. Each tribe had respect for another's territory. That's just how it was. But with the treaty, like with other countries, it was more of, what they consider, and I, correct me anybody if I'm wrong, but what they considered to me was unclaimed. This territory wasn't unclaimed. The tribal people were here, but that's kind of the thought process is, oh, this is unclaimed, so any explorer that comes in can claim it for Spain, for, all these other countries. And it's like, that's not true. That wasn't true. We were here, we're still here, but there was just no thought process of that. It's like, oh, there's these people here, they're feeding us, they're helping us survive, they're transporting us in their canoes, they're doing all of these things, but it was just like, we were just these invisible people that, no thought of, we're taking their land. And that's, so with the treaty here, that's what I'm saying, tribes didn't have to have a treaty amongst each other. There was territory, and they knew whose territory was whose, and that's, like I said, when we talk about the language was always descriptive. So you could tell another tribal person, this is where you go, or this, but it was a descriptive, like the mountains, that kind of thing. We didn't name them after people, it was just a way of telling another tribe, you go here, and they knew what you were talking about, whether it was a mountain, whether it was a river, whether, some kind of landmark, but like I said, for here, that, that always is just like, it wasn't unclaimed, we were here, so.
When I was in graduate school, I read The Horse Catcher by Mary Sandoz. I don't know if any of you have read it, but I'm guessing a lot of people who are listening tonight read the Little House on the Prairie books. And when I read The Horse Catcher, it was one of those tectonic shifts, right, of my understanding of place and what place meant to a group of people. I had always thought of the prairies of the Great Plains as great, vast, wide open, empty places. And when you read The Horse Catcher, you understand very specifically how intimately connected the native people who lived there knew that place, knew every foot of it, right? And knew what all the relationships between the different parts of it. And I think that's true, is that if you come into a place not understanding the relationship to the landscape and the land, then it's very hard for you to understand another person's relationship to it. Yeah. I just remember being just like, stop yourself in your tracks reading that book. It just knocked me upside the head to understand that. A little embarrassed it took me till graduate school. Okay, so the next question is, there were years before the treaties were signed, there were people here living here together. And this person is wondering, how were conflicts between Native people and settlers solved or resolved prior to the treaty? Because there must have been conflicts, I'm guessing.
Well, there were a variety of ways. One of the more garish ones was there was a shooting episode at Fort Nisqually in 1849, the 1st of May, 1849. It was basically a conflict between a group of Snoqualmies and a group of Nisquallies that happened to come to a head at the gate of Fort Nisqually, but it left several people lying dead in the meadow after about 30 seconds of gunfire. And the Snoqualmies went back to their homeland and thought it was pretty well over. But it was the first big test of the new American government. This is 1849. We're still Lewis County, Oregon Territory at the time. And the governor of Oregon Territory sent up a marshal who came to Fort Nisqually, got 80 blankets, and offered a reward for the Snoqualmies who had killed an American settler named Leander Wallace. He's several natives died that day too, but the one that history and the settlers at the time tend to remember is Leander Wallace. And eventually, 2 members of the Snoqualmie tribe were hanged in October 1849. And that was maybe the first inkling that this government, whatever it is, can do some pretty horrible stuff to you. Before that, a way of setting things right may have been to basically pay a fine for what you've done. You pay in blankets or whatever. But these 2, they're not even certain now that they got the right to. They were hanged for the death of Leander Wallace. In other cases, there were conflicts. It tended to be that the government would protect the white citizens and not generally not address the killing of natives by the settlers. That's another place where you start to realize that you know, we're not, they're not dealing with us in the same way. They're not, you know, they're not treating us the same way they treat the white citizens. It's another place where, you know, some distrust and resentment probably started to grow.
That's true. There's also that context. So,
I'm sure nobody remembers what the issue was between the Nisqually and Snoqualmie. It could have been pretty simple, but most of the time the people here on South Puget Sound were pretty compatible. They got along well. I used to talk about our biggest threat came from up north when somebody from maybe Quackudle or somewhere else was coming down and trying to take slaves back up north. And so we really didn't have too many planned war tactics for how do we go out and raid something. We didn't do raids on other places, but we did know how to run into the forest and hide when we heard the canoes from more up north coming, and you could leave your elders and children behind. Well, maybe not the children, but the elders, because they didn't want those. But they would come down and come to the longhouse and take people back up north with them. And if you were out in the woods hiding, then you were safe. And we protected each other. Hey, the guys are coming from up north again. So yeah,
but you know, that's kind of why tribal leaders or tribes selected their own tribal leaders, you know, for conflicts so that it would be treated immediately. And so you see what, you know, in stories or history, tribal leaders went in and took care of it, you know, whether it was because of a tribe to tribe or tribe to non-native tribal person, you know, they handled it. And to me, they were just, you know, even if they had to turn their own person in, if they did wrong, they did wrong, you know, but they wanted justice. They didn't want you abusing them, beating them, but, you know, they just handle it as a tribal leader. And you find that among tribes, and that's one of the reasons they had intertribal marriages. You know, those were arranged marriages. My grandma was one of them, but that was partly to settle these things so that there wasn't this conflict, you know, that the tribes had, you know, something in common. And that was kind of one of the conflicts that I've seen is, you know, if they were being mistreated, you know, if it was the wife, you know, her tribe would come in and tell them, you know, you're not to be doing that. But the tribal leaders handled it. You know, it wasn't just this all out, you know, let's just take everybody. And, you know, there was that was the reason for selecting the tribal leader that was needed at the time to deal with this.
so that's actually one question that I think we'll end on, because we're right at the end of time, but we didn't cover that as thoroughly in our discussion, is the identification of tribal leaders and the difference between perhaps who was chosen as what Stevens called a chief for the tribal council, for the treaty council, versus that what you're talking about, Netsi, which is the more fluid and organic and sort of responsive to the situation identification of leaders within the community. Would somebody like to talk about the difference there and what happened and what it meant for the treaty process? Big question, I know.
That's a hard one, Jennifer, because for the longest time, it took a lot of research to actually go back and pull out who were the names that then end up on the treaty, who were those people and what were their relationship to even a specific tribe. It's still hard to do that. We can go back and say, hey, we know that this person is a Steilacoom ancestor, but were they a leader? Somebody that was recognized as the head person for the tribe at the time? Whose names got on there? And yeah, I don't know. I mean, that's really, it's like, if anything invalidates the treaty more than anything else, it's really the names that are on the treaty and the claim. And of course, you know, as Warren said, Stevens was working under the direction he got from the president, which said, you go out there and you get treaties with all the people, and this was his best effort to gather all the tribes from Puget Sound together in one location and get a treaty. He realized he failed. They still didn't know back in Washington, D.C. that there was a big divide with the Cascade Mountains that separated the culture of the people on the Puget Sound from the people in Eastern Washington. That was still part of the territory too. And so starting here, it's like, maybe that was a big chunk of the tribes, but he knew he had lots of work ahead of him. I don't know what letter he sent back and said, hey, look, I've done it. And then now I'm going to scramble and do 9 more because I know I really didn't do it.
I'll add to that too. Was it in keeping with the local traditions that it was all men? Or would you have expected to see at least one woman amongst that crowd?
So you know what, I think this is great. That would be a lovely story to go on, because most of our tribal leaders end up being female in today's even 20th century tribal leaders. The women, I think, were the power behind most of the decisions that happened in the tribes, but anthropologists would say that we were patrilineal in nature. And I think it was just men who felt like they were in charge, but they weren't really. And so they got credit. I mean, they're the ones that Stevens wanted to show up on the treaty. I bet you the women were really still making the power decisions there, even at that time in the 1800s.
But you know, one of the things when you talk about the women, look at through the history, look at a lot of these guides, and a lot of it had to do with arranged marriages. So I don't claim to pronounce it correct, but you know, Sacagawea, who guided, you know, she was from a different tribe. You know, one of her goals was because she could go back and see her tribe as they passed through the land. So you get a lot of these women in that role, you know, that even though they were married to somebody else, you know, it was kind of home was calling them. And so they did what they had to do with their child, you know, so there really wasn't anything that they couldn't do. But like you said, it just depended on who was looking at it. But they sought them out, you know, they sought them out to help them guide and take care of them. You know, they knew these things. So it's there. It just wasn't as prominent as what you're saying on the treaty, you know, because of who Stevens and his officials chose, you know, to do the signing or so-called signing.
Stevens said the men were the ones that needed to sign, but I still think that there is something else happening there. And you know what? It made the men feel good too. They may have said, all right, I'll protect you. I'll be the guy that goes out and stands in front. What do you think I should do? I think that there was still a lot of that happened. And culturally, as we go back and hear our stories, the women in our culture play a very prominent leadership and guiding and wise wisdom role for everything that took place. It's like that, you can't deny that. And you know, that was just prejudicial assignment by Stevens more than anything else.
I see you nodding, Brandon.
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly it. I mean, the thought of a woman leader was just such a foreign concept to these, you know, military men, you know, that, you know, women are supposed to be at home and, you know, just house, whereas, you know, we're here for us. I mean, we were a matriarchal society. I mean, women had just as much power, you know, and they were involved in every decision. And, you know, like Chairman said, you know, even today, that's never gone away, regardless of what the treaty did, and regardless of what all the effects of, you know, the genocide that we faced. You know, was, you know, women are still in leadership roles in all of our tribal councils, you know, and so yeah, women were definitely there, but Stevens refused to recognize their authority.
Great. So we are just about out of time. I just want to direct people to look through the chat. People have been posting some really great links and pieces of information. And there's a couple questions that we didn't get to, but I think Elizabeth will let you know if we're able to answer those maybe in follow-up information, or at least to send you to different resources in order to find out more. Because there have been there are some great resources that are out there to help answer these questions. So before I pass it off to Elizabeth, I just want to say thank you again. You are an amazing panel to discuss these things with, and I look forward to our next one. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Jennifer. And I just want to make one comment. I advise everybody to read Medicine Creek Treaty article by article, and then tell us what you get out of it, because I don't know if it'll be the same, but please read the whole thing through. Like I said, I see all of these questions here, and there's, it's in the articles, and I don't think you'd agree to it nowadays.
Just in the first document. Yep, just take a look at it.
I liked what Warren said earlier too, and I wonder, was there the first draft, the one that everybody fought against? I mean, it was rewritten, right? Have we ever seen that first one? I don't think it's, that would be neat to see, because how much did it change?
Quite a few historians that would give their right arm to see that.
Well, we've got to remember too that after Medicine Creek and after the war came the Fox Island Council, which made some significant changes in corrections. Still not nearly enough, but it was better than what was offered at Medicine Creek, at least. And hey, we got Warren here tonight because it put Muckleshoot, created the Muckleshoot reservation as well, which was not part of the Medicine Creek treaty. So I think what we've seen is basically the draft that was presented at Medicine Creek, but things did happen afterward that made a difference when you convened at Fox Island and you started to talk to people about what do you really need and want. There might not have been a war if that had happened beforehand. But it might not have happened if there hadn't been a war too.
That was a great segue, Jerry. That will be
Take it away, Elizabeth.
The focus of our next panel discussion will be focusing on the war itself, and we look forward to inviting all of you back to have that conversation. And I just want to thank all of our panelists so much for sharing your knowledge, your histories, and your perspectives tonight. It's once again a tremendous program, and we're eager to invite all of you back this fall for our next panel. I don't even want to try to paraphrase what the conversation was tonight in the takeaways, because it was just so perfectly shared by all of you. So we'll let everybody enjoy. Warren, did you want to say something? Nope. Okay. All right. Thank you so much, all of you. We will be following up with you in an email. Please reach out to us with your questions about the conversations we've had tonight, about future panels, and do visit the websites that have been shared in the chat a couple times to links to the tribal websites that our panelists represent tonight. And we will meet you all again shortly. And thank you all. We've got a new panelist here with Brandon, so we'll bring him on next time. Thank you all so much.
Good night.